All right. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about moral psychology, kind of moral epistemology. And you can think of both of these fields. Epistemology is about the science of how we come to understand things, or the philosophy of it, rather. And it's most concerned with how we justify things. Okay, so what makes something a better belief or a better proposition to hold over another? Moral psychology is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically psychological ideas about our faculties and how we think in relation to making moral or ethical decisions or in moral or ethical situations. All right. So tonight, we're going to delve into a little bit of that stuff, and it's informed by some of the interviews that are in Tamler Summers' Very Bad Wizard, in addition to a few other articles. And the most important article, I think, for this was definitely the interviews in Tamler Summers' Very Bad Wizard, but also Jonathan Bennett's The Conscience of Huckleberry Finn, which is probably one of my all-time favorite papers. There were hopefully some other enjoyable things to read, but we're going to delve into those questions. How should I be making these types of decisions? And in particular, I think that there are two questions relevant for what we've been studying this semester. One is, which faculty of our mind here, grasps morality? All right. We've seen lots of different positions, and I'll go over this, but think about what aspect of ourselves or how we reflect on the world or interact with the world, how do we come to understand morality, right? And then secondly, and this is where it was in the Peter Singer Ethics and Intuitions piece, it was in the interviews for Tamler Summers, it's in a lot of moral psychological literature, but does our faculty's evolution affect our evaluation of that faculty or even of the entire enterprise of morality? Right? So our minds definitely have evolutionary paths. We weren't just, created out of nothing, boom, boomer just existed and that's it, right? We have histories. Our faculties evolved in certain situations. They've changed over millennia, right? Whenever we learn more about the evolution of our faculties, does that change how we kind of think about these issues? Okay, so before I delve into the final questions of the lecture, basically the way this is structured is I'm going to set up a couple of different options, right? So one issue or one position within moral psychology or moral epistemology broadly could just be the idea of rationalism. And what I mean by this, sometimes this is also called intellectualism, is the idea that we should use reason, okay? Use reason. That's the most important component, okay? Reason and intellect are what allow us to understand what moral principles are, or how to construct rules for ourselves, or how to figure out what the appropriate thing to aim at in the situation is. We saw this in the historical philosophers. Kant, through and through, is a rationalist. The utilitarians, through and through, are rationalists. You use your reason to figure out the principles that you abide by, Kant, or you use your reason to figure out how to maximize the good and the consequences of whatever the actions are, utilitarianism, right? And the second component of this is often this is combined with the idea that emotions, they distract us, or they're irrelevant, or maybe they're unreliable. So rationalism, use reason. Why? Well, it's because emotions, they tend to distract us, or they're irrelevant, or they're unreliable. Just think about the up and the downs of your mood or something like that, right? Or think about how partial emotions are. I like people who I grew up around. I don't like people who I didn't grow up around, at least as a rule, right? That's kind of what's going on here. And I think that I found a pretty good example of this in Peter Singer, where he talks about the example of Bat Kid. So the Make-A-Wish Foundation famously granted this kid up in the Pacific Northwest his wish to become Bat Kid for a day. So they shut down, I think it was Seattle's downtown for an afternoon. And they had, a Batmobile and all sorts of props. And they had a scenario for him to act through. So he was able to be Bat Kid for a day. And it was his make-a-wish, right? So he had a terminal illness. This was one thing that he wanted to do before he died. Peter Singer doesn't think necessarily that that was a bad thing, right? Some good came of that. However, he's going to say that a lot of times whenever we're doing stuff like granting make-a-wish stuff, right? Or we're looking at these scenarios, we are more concerned with the warm fuzziness, the feelings that we have, rather than thinking through these things rationally. And so here's his ultimate take. Yet we can still ask if these emotions are the best guide to what we ought to do. According to Make-A-Wish, the average cost is $7,500. That sum, if donated to the Against Malaria Foundation, so they buy malaria nets for people in malaria-stricken parts of the world, it could save lives of at least 2 or 3 children. If donated to the Fistula Foundation, it could pay for surgeries of approximately 17 young mothers who, without assistance, are likely to be outcast for the rest of their lives. So if you don't know what a fistula is, basically in childbirth, there is a wearing of the barriers between the vagina and the colon or the anus, such that basically excrement comes out the vagina. This can lead to health complications, but at the very least, it leads to ostracization, right? And he's saying with that same money, you could repair that with surgery, right? And change the lives of 17 young mothers. The same money, if donated to the SIVA Foundation, so they help with, trachoma and other forms of blindness, could protect 100 children from losing their sight as they grow older. It's obvious, isn't it, that saving a child's life is better than fulfilling a child's wish to be Bat Kid. So Peter Singer here is saying, look, we need to really reconsider how we're using our money to help people out. It makes us feel good, and there is some good in helping the kid pretend to be Bat Kid for a day, right? But literally, that same amount of money that helped give a kid a good afternoon could save 2 to 3 children from malaria. It could help 17 young mothers to be, reintegrated into society. Or it could prevent blindness in 100 children. And again, it's that utilitarian thing. Good afternoon for 1 kid, saving the lives of 3 kids, or saving 100 kids from blindness, or, helping over a dozen mothers to be reintegrated into society. The emotions here are distracting, right? Peter Singer doesn't deny that these things tug on our heartstrings, but he does deny that that should matter. We should be thinking rationally, right? This is the rationalism aspect. Whenever we're considering, what we should do in a scenario, we need to be using our head, not our heart. And in fact, the title of this article, you can look it up. It's like a short read. I think it's in the Washington Post. It is, "Heartwarming causes are nice, but let's give to charity with our heads," which is basically, the short, pithy version of rationalism. So we saw this again in Kant. We saw it in, utilitarianism. This is just an example of the rationalism side. For sentimentalism, I'm going to use the work of Audre Lorde. Honestly, the piece that we read for today, uses of the erotic as power, is kind of a complicated essay to interpret. There's a lot of different angles here. She herself was a poet and an activist. She was not a philosopher. So I don't think that she was trying to write with these academic philosophical concerns in mind. That said, she's incredibly intelligent and very, very eloquent. And I think what she's going to espouse is something like this, which basically is like, look, we need to use our emotion. We saw this in Hume. What is the basis of morality? It's our moral sentiments, especially extensive sympathy, right? She's going to say it's the erotic, which is a form of love. And it applies to ourselves, others, how we interact with the world. This is not rationalism because it's not about thinking. It's not about principles. It's not about, overarching moral systems. It's about feelings here, right here. Often, this can be combined with the idea that reason, it's lifeless, right? Or it's impotent. It doesn't do anything. This is why Hume spends so much time saying that if we want people to act, we need to make sure that the reasons are attached to passions or desires. Reason is and not only be the slave of the passions, Hume says, which basically is saying, the gut is going to set the ends, and we need to carefully cultivate the emotions because that's where the values are coming from. Reason is important, but only secondarily. Or maybe reason is limited in the same way that rationalists accuse sentimentalists of basically saying that, emotions, they're erratic and they're biased, right? I feel much more positive toward any of my romantic partners when I'm in a relationship with them as opposed to a stranger, right? That's why the rationalists are going to say the sentiments or love, those are horribly biased. Why would we do that, right? The sentimentalists, they're going to look at reason and they're going to say, yeah, your reason doesn't fare any better. Science is always done from a particular point of view. And when you look at the history of sciences have been wrong way more often than they've been right. You can look at the institution of science and look at how it's been biased toward basically white males. Only now, look at the Nobel winners for today. There's a handful of women scientists who won it. That was not the standard, right? For a long time, Marie Curie was the one who was kind of holding it down. So they're going to say, you might pretend that science or reason are unbiased, but they're not. And if we want to get at the core of understanding, if you really listen to your emotions, to that sympathy, being able to take another person's perspective or feel their suffering, or to love, just feeling fulfilled, that's a better basis for morality, right? That's a better basis. And I think that I found a really great quote from Audre Lorde because I think that this is one of the core ideas in her essay. And she says, "For once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy which we know ourselves to be capable of." Okay, so she's writing from the perspective of a Black lesbian woman. Okay, and she's going to say, look, if you have, any awareness of this, and I think most women, have been told these types of things before, and it's sort of cross-cultural, in fact. So in Latino culture, right, you get this idea of the self-sacrificial sort of Virgin Mary, long-suffering romantic partner or mother, right? In broader Western culture, you get the idea of hysteria, the idea that women are crazy because of using their emotions, that their pleasure isn't as important. You look at the Motion Picture Association of America, and literally, vaginas are way more offensive according to the standards than penises. Films have been censored for showing a woman's pleasure, right? You can kind of look this kind of stuff up. And she's saying, look, whenever you're coming from this sort of context, what this is teaching us is to avoid our thinking about the erotic, avoid thinking about our own joy and fulfillment. And if instead we learn to pay attention to that, we would actually refuse to put up with a lot of stuff in our lives, whether it's in our relationships, whether it's in political structures, whether it's in careers, whatever else it is. We need to listen to how we're feeling. We need to listen to whether or not we're fulfilled in whatever circumstances we're in. Because we've been putting up with being degraded for far too long, and we've been told for far too long that we shouldn't be paying attention to these sentimental bases that can help us to understand things. And I think that that's part of the sentimentalism that's like a very, very strong case, in addition to the Hume, right? In addition to the Hume. So we have rationalism, use reason. We have sentimentalism, use some sort of emotion. And then, honestly, we have probably hybrid positions. And this is where the Jonathan Bennett piece comes in, okay? The Jonathan Bennett piece, I think, is just so... It's wonderful. It's wonderful because, the thesis is important. And I'll get to the thesis, but also it illustrates things in a very convincing way. First, I just want to mention Aristotle, okay? Aristotle is mostly a rationalist or an intellectualist, okay? So he should probably be in that camp. But as opposed to the utilitarians and as opposed to the Kantians, Aristotle is going to say, if you neglect the emotions, you cannot be fully virtuous, right? You are probably insensate. And there's many moments where he says this sort of stuff. It's the person who gives to charity, but who feels conflicted and hates poor people. Aristotle's going to say, yeah, that person's not fully virtuous. Aristotle also says, look, anger is really, really important. If you see injustice in the world and you don't feel angry, that's probably indicative of you being really, really insensate. You're insensitive. You don't understand how the world is working. You should be upset about bad stuff, right? The Stoics didn't like that. Stoics are also rationalists. So even though Aristotle says that reason sort of runs the game, it's the best faculty, the emotions are necessary. And if you neglect them, you're not good enough, okay? So I think that Aristotle is offering kind of a hybrid position. Jonathan Bennett, I think, is even more of a hybrid in the sense that he uses all of his examples throughout the paper to say that we need to keep all of our mental faculties running well. Okay. And he divides it between our basically like moral principles, what we could call reason, whenever we subscribe to moral views. And he says, listen, right? Whatever moral code you abide by, you can't help but hold it sincerely. That's what it means for you to be living the way that you live. Okay? We all want to do right. We want to do good by our moral principles. That's important. That's really, really important. But he says, we also have faculties, fellow feeling, sympathy, right? And that can allow us to pay attention to the suffering of others. And he uses multiple examples throughout his paper. He uses the example of Jonathan Edwards. And he says Jonathan Edwards, the Protestant minister, fire and brimstone, is an example of, right, someone who has reason but completely neglects their emotions. Okay? Jonathan Edwards thought if you were a sinner, you deserved hell in the worst way possible. And that's just part of it. So whenever reason and emotion conflict, the Edwards solution is to say, ignore emotions. They're just not even relevant. Just keep the reason. Then he uses the example of one of the top people in the Nazi government, Heinrich Himmler. And he says Himmler is an example of someone whenever reason and emotion conflict, which he says you can see Himmler had stomach problems, GI problems. He felt bad about the genocide of Jewish people and other types of people in Europe. But he so believed in the Nazi project that he basically suppressed or repressed his emotional responses and just kept going forward. And who's the hero of his essay? The hero of his essay is Huckleberry Finn. And Huckleberry Finn is basically taking a raft, up the Mississippi River to get to the north. He's helping Jim the slave escape. And there's a point in the novel whenever it's looking like he's going to be found out. Someone is shouting from the shore on the raft, hey, what's going on? And Huck is thinking, what should I do? Now, Huck is, from the South. He knows that Jim is someone's property. Jim is like talking about how he's going to escape to the north and rescue his family, right? Huck knows that he's going to be in deep trouble if it's found out that he's helping a slave to escape. That's what his principles are telling him. That's what his reasons are telling him. But his heart guides him otherwise. He starts to think about how Jim is his friend. He starts to think about the worthiness of Jim's cause, and he lets his emotion revise his principles. okay? Bennett basically says we need to be open to revising all of our moral principles. And one of the ways that we are driven to revise our principles is by keeping our sympathies sharp, right? We shouldn't deaden our sympathies like Jonathan Edwards, right? And unlike Himmler and unlike many other people, we should pay really, really clear attention to the suffering of other people. So Jonathan Bennett has this holistic psychological thesis. We need both reason and emotion. And the enterprise of morality does well whenever all functions are working well, and whenever we're open to revision. Now that means that some sort of central, principle or idea within how we think we should live our lives, what a good life is, what our moral principles are, it means that we need to admit that we could be wrong. And not just like casually wrong. If we're wrong about a math problem, whatever, maybe our pride is hurt a little bit. But if we're wrong about what we think happiness is or how to live life, that's a little bit more personal, right? But we know that we could be wrong, just in the way that historically many other people have been wrong. So this Bennett piece, it's not rationalist, it's not sentimentalist, right? It's basically saying we need both, and he's not really trying to give us a priority. He's not trying to give us a priority. We need both. They need to function. We need to be open to revision, right? So those are kind of the three categories. We have rationalism. It's all about reason. We have sentimentalism. It's all about some sort of emotion or sentiment. And we have a hybrid theory, which is we need both, right? We need both. Now, before I move on, I will say that the benefit of choosing rationalism or sentimentalism is that whenever there's a conflict between reason and emotion, you know which one you're going to side with, right? The hybrid theory, on the upside, is that it seems right that sometimes we feel things deeply. It seems right that sometimes we think and we have to avoid our emotional biases as well. But the downside is now we don't know how to resolve a conflict between the two. Okay? Now, side note, I think that there's probably some Aztec or Nahua philosophy that can help us here. If you're interested in that, look up Sebastian Purcell. He's been writing a lot. He writes very, very accessibly. But the idea that the Aztecs talk about is that you keep your faculties in balance with each other. Okay? Sometimes reason, sometimes emotions. I can't defend this interpretation here, but this hybrid thing, it's a really fascinating thing, and I think it's something that some of you have asked me questions about, so I just wanted to spend a couple of moments. Okay. We have the three positions. Rationalism use reason, sentimentalism use emotions or sentiments. Hybrid, it's both. How do we investigate this? How can we adjudicate the sort of debate? How do we find evidence for one position over others? Well, that's why we read some of the empirical stuff, okay? And so I want to start out with the work of Jonathan Haidt. He was a psychologist for a very long time. By the way, he has this fantastic book called The Happiness Hypothesis. If you're into sort of like accessible psychology and philosophy, totally check that out. It's on Audible. I listened to it a few summers ago on a road trip. I really, really enjoyed it. Haidt is like a really great writer. So just wanted to plug that book very, very quickly. But here's a scenario, okay? Here's a scenario. Hopefully you did the reading, but if you didn't do the reading, this is a vignette that Jonathan Haidt used in his psychological studies, and he would read these vignettes to people and record people's reactions and the reasons that they offered for, the judgment that they were asking for. Okay, so here's a photo. They didn't, I don't think, use a photo, but I use it just for the sake of the presentation. Here it is. Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They're traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night, they're staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about that? Was it okay for them to make love? Okay, so just take a couple of seconds and think about this. Mark and Julie, brother and sister, taking a nice trip in France, out on a beach, so secluded, right? They like each other, they decide to make love. Julie's on birth control, Mark uses a condom. They like the experience, they really enjoyed it, but they decide, we shouldn't do this, and we'll just keep this as a secret, and it'll just kind of like bring us closer together, right? Are you okay with that? So whenever Haidt and his experimenters asked people this, they obviously weren't. This scenario, along with many others, is designed to elicit disgust and sort of see how that calculates, right? And the scenario is designed to remove most reasons why people might be against something like an incest scenario. All right? It is brother-sister, so it's not parent-child. It's not exploitation in that sense, okay? They both enjoyed it, so there's no even close to anything as far as non-consensual scenario. They're on a beach, so they're secluded. People wouldn't see them or what's going on. They enjoyed the scenario, and they decide to keep it a secret, so no one's really going to find out. They use 2 forms of birth control, so there's no chance that a child is going to be born. So what reasons could you offer here that would be against this, right? And people often try to say, well, what happens if there's a kid? Birth control, right? What happens if someone finds out? It was secluded. Whenever they did it, they were in a completely different continent, in a secluded part of the continent. They decide not to tell anyone. So eventually, this leads some people to experience moral dumbfounding. And this is the idea that they have a judgment. In this case, it's wrong for Mark and Julie to do this, but they don't have a reason for it. They just say, look, it's just wrong what they did. It's just wrong. It's just wrong. Okay? And so they did lots of, variations of this. You can look up Jonathan Haidt's work. It's very, very famous. And eventually he came up with the social intuitionist model. Okay, so this is kind of a complicated diagram. What I want you to do is to ignore everything except for the first row for now. Okay? So basically what he says is there's a triggering event. This is like the vignette. And we get some sort of intuition. So this is broadly sentimentalist, a feeling that makes us lead to a judgment. Something was right or wrong. And then that leads to reasoning. Okay? So you get the triggering event, you get some sort of feeling, and then the feeling leads to a judgment. It was right or wrong. And then reason only comes after the fact. After the fact. Reason is not at the helm. It's not ahead of the game. It comes after the fact. The phrase here that Summers uses and that other people use is reason as the press secretary of the emotions. The press secretary doesn't make any decisions in the presidential cabinet, right? The press secretary comes out to sell a story to the press to make sense of what judgment has already been made. So Haidt thinks something similar. We experience certain things out there in the world. We have some sort of deep emotional feeling that leads to a judgment, and then reason comes afterward to kind of explain what's going on. Okay. Hopefully you get that, right? That's different than the rationalist model, which is going to say, we're faced with the scenario, we think about it, and then we make the judgment. The emotions just kind of drop out, right? Why this is important is on the rationalist model, So think of the Mark and Julie case. If the reasons change, the judgment should change, right? If the reasons change, the judgment should change on the rationalist model. So in the Mark and Julie case, a rationalist might start out thinking, hey, this is wrong. But then once you start to go through all of the decisions and you knock away all of the reasons, the rationalist should be willing to change their mind to say, oh, well, I guess it's okay, right? I guess it's okay. Like, personally, I wouldn't do it, maybe they might say, but like, I guess it's okay. That's what should happen if rationalism is kind of what's describing how people make decisions. That's not what happens with a lot of people. A lot of people maintain that gut feeling and the judgment. And despite the fact that all of the reasons have been eliminated, the judgment doesn't change. So what that shows is once you knock out the reason, if the judgment doesn't change, the reasons aren't doing anything to influence the judgment. It's emotions or something else. I hope that makes sense. If reasons are actually the reason that we're making the judgment, if those change, the judgment should change. But if the reasons get eliminated and the judgment stays the same, it's something else that is the basis or the cause for that particular judgment. That's kind of what Jonathan Haidt is getting at. So now that we have that, you can look at this second sort of row, and that is there's multiple people. So you have A and you have B. B is another person. And so you see also all of these arrows kind of going backwards. Haidt fully admits, like, he's a psychologist. He's saying, look, I'm just trying to find a model that explains how we think. This is descriptive more than normative, or at least at its basis, right? Describing how we actually do it, maybe not should, although this is debatable on the Haidt case, but how we do it, right? And he's going to say, look, there are a small amount of rationalists out there. You can think of like a really well-trained judge, okay? Judges can be impartial to a scenario. They can dislike people in the case, but then they still say, look, according to the law, this is what I think should happen. There are people, if the reasons change, the judgment changes. Some philosophers are like this. Not all philosophers, but some philosophers, right? We're weird people. But there are ways in which, reason can affect, it can train our emotions, right? We find out new information and that changes how we feel. It can change our judgment if we enter into some sort of debate. Or there's the social aspect. We can see other people making judgments, and if we admire them, maybe that helps us to think better. If we don't like them and they're on our side, right, maybe that makes us think differently. Think of something like presidential endorsements, right, and who's doing the endorsement. That sort of stuff. So it's really complicated, but the Haidt case is really just meant to show reasons typically aren't doing the work that philosophers think they're doing, right? More often it's the emotions. This should feel very much like Hume. It's kind of a contemporary psychological analog of a lot of Humean ideas. Okay? And eventually he develops the 5 moral foundations. There's potentially a 6th one with liberty and libertarianism, but I'm just going to use the 5. And what this diagram is basically showing is, look, each of the vertical columns is a type of emotion that we have, a foundation. All right? So for example, the first one is care or harm. And what that responds to is suffering or pain. And he offers sort of the evolutionary story that the reason that developed is because we need to ensure care for one another, right? It's really, really important that we respond to suffering and pain and that we develop this aspect of paying attention to care and harm. The second one, fairness or cheating, okay? This responds to cheating or deception, basically not following through with stuff, right? Why would this evolve? Well, whatever biological stories you've heard about the brutality of nature, humans are eusocial creatures. They've developed because they're able to cooperate in large groups and accomplish things in groups that they couldn't accomplish on their own. Cooperation is really, really important to us. It makes sense that we would have some sort of moral foundation or emotion that responds to cheating and deception, right? Because when that's violated, we know we can't cooperate with that someone, okay? Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is what the two horizontal bars at the bottom are saying. Liberals and conservatives, because he applies this to politics, liberals and conservatives both hold the care, harm, and fairness cheating foundation. Everyone thinks that those are great. If those get violated, pretty much everyone is going to say that action is wrong. If someone gets cheated or if someone is suffering, right? But liberals are going to stop there. Liberals are going to stop there. That's it, okay? As long as it doesn't violate those two, they're going to be sort of like non-committal on the rest of the things. The conservative, by contrast, he says, is going to have 3 additional values. Loyalty or betrayal, which deals with threats to your group. So in addition to just cooperating with people, we have in-groups and out-groups, right? And it helps us to form cohesive coalitions. The better our group functions, the stronger it is, the more challenges we can weather. Okay? Society is really fragile. It's really, really fragile. You see this anytime that there's some sort of social unrest. So it makes sense that we would have evolved some sort of foundation to be loyal toward our in-group, our families, our tribes, whatever else it is. There's the authority or subversion, right? Which is the idea that sometimes there are power structures that we need to figure out. This is, something that's important with chain of command. The, exemplar here is something like the military. A military, which is a hugely complex organization, cannot make good enough decisions if it is not organized. And in order for it to be organized and to make decisions quickly enough in life or death scenarios, you have to follow chain of command. It's not that you can't challenge orders. It's that, for the most part, you're going to fall in line. And it's bad if someone subverts that authority, because stuff is really complex and sometimes you need to move stuff along the chain of command. Conservatives also have the sanctity or degradation pillar, which typically responds to waste and disease, right? And it's to promote health. So why are we disgusted with, feces or blood or unclean foods? Well, typically that's, one way that we've been able to stay healthy. All right. So now Haidt says conservatives, if any of those 5 pillars are violated, that's going to lead to a negative judgment with respect to that. Whereas with liberals, it's only the first 2. So let's go back to the Mark and Julie case, right? Back to the Mark and Julie case. None of these pillars are violated for the liberal because the care harm, no one's suffering. There's no pain here. They enjoyed it, in fact, right? And there's no deception. They're brothers and sisters. They're having a good time. They talk with each other about this. There's no deception. It's an open relationship. And because there's no violation there, there's no reason to have a negative judgment with respect to that if you are quote unquote liberal. However, the conservative is still going to have that sanctity or degradation thing, right? It's a taboo, not only in humans, but also in other primates, to have any sort of incestuous relationship. Why? It makes sense that we would have evolved a taboo against incest because that will lead to bad genetics, right? Especially, first relations, brother-sister. Brother-sister, that's not an incest that you want to promote, right? And because that pillar is violated, conservatives sort of feel that, right? Or maybe it's something about the group cohesion. So you could make an argument maybe for loyalty betrayal. I think that the conservatives might be able to make an argument for that. So the liberals don't feel that, but the conservatives do. So conservatives are way more likely to say that the Mark and Julie case is wrong, right? So this Jonathan Haidt thing, he's trying to give us an account of the sentiments or the intuitions that we use to judge particular things. Okay. And I think Jonathan Haidt another really big component of his work was basically just showing he himself, he's like, look, I am a liberal person. I am an atheist Jew. I went to really liberal institutions. He was educated at Yale. He says things, all sorts of stuff. He just lays it all out on the counter. I am a liberal, he says. But I think liberals are making a huge mistake if they think that just because conservatives do not share the same reasons, that they're irrational or they don't have good reasons. Because in my studies, what I've found time and time again is that they do have consistent bases for their judgments. It's just that they're different than the liberal morality, right? And so he tries to get the two sides to kind of talk to each other. And he says, look, both sides have something really important to say. Conservatives, why are conservative values good? Because it's hard to get large groups of people to work together. Okay? And the more cohesion that we have, the more that we respect authority, the more complex organizations can be. If every order is challenged, right? And if everything has to be passed through a similarly rigorous process, stuff gets bogged down, right? If every threat or every outsider is automatically treated as a friend and you're sort of not punished whenever they violate rules, that's also a way in which people can, lose cohesion. People can be overtaken by ill-intentioned people out there. But liberals are also right, because those very structures that we make that allow us to have complex organizations and to be more powerful in society, those can become oppressive and they can start to hurt people who are in the minority. And we need to really pay attention to the ways in which the structures that we create can be used to do counterproductive and really bad things that harm a lot of people. And so he doesn't offer any solution here. He just tries to bring the two sides into dialogue with one another. All right. So Haidt is offering a sort of sentimentalist picture again. Sentimentalist picture. What do we make of his experimental evidence with these vignettes or with this theory of moral foundations? That's the question. All right. So the second set of evidence that I'm going to talk about is the work of Joshua Greene and Liane Young. Josh Greene was a Princeton philosophy PhD. He did lots of experiments with neuroscience and functional MRIs. Liane Young, I think, is more securely in psychology and neuroscience. I think she's at Boston College now, and they work together. And basically what they did was they put people in an fMRI. So if you've ever had an MRI, it's the machine that has like a giant circle. It's a really powerful magnet. And what it does is it reads what parts of your body are kind of moving with various sensitivities, or how they're metabolizing energy in the case of the brain. And what they did was they tried to look at the brains of people and how they made moral judgments and give them different scenarios to see if different areas of the brain were activated for different types of moral conclusions. And the scenarios that they used most famously were the trolley problem. Okay, so the trolley problem, also, if you've seen The Good Place, there's, some really gory and hilarious scenes in this with Chidi trying to teach people, right? But the trolley problem is the idea that there's this trolley, it's headed down the tracks. If you do nothing, it's going to plow into 5 people, right? But you happen to be by a lever. And if you pull that lever, it's going to divert to a track and it's going to kill just one person. Now, the trolley, there's no way to stop it otherwise. You're too far away to say, get out of the way. The only thing that you can do is either not pull the lever or pull the lever, right? So the question is, do you pull the lever here? Do you pull the lever? Okay. Most people do. Most people do. All right. And whenever you ask them, why do you pull the lever? And they'll say, look, I pull the lever because I can save the lives of the 5 people at the expense of just one person. And that seems like the right thing to do. So they offer utilitarian reasons. I do the one, I sacrifice the one for the benefit of the five. Consequentialist reasoning, right? Yeah, maybe it's a little disconcerting. I don't like that I have to pull the lever, but I pull the lever because it's going to save more people. Now, there's lots of examples of the trolley problem. The second one is what gets called the big person variant, the large person variant. And so the idea is same sort of thing. Trolley, running down the tracks, it's going to kill 5 people if you do nothing. But you happen to be on a footbridge and there happens to be a gigantic person. So I've been watching a lot of, strongman stuff. Imagine like a 500-pound world's strongest man type, really huge. And if you throw them off of the footbridge, they're sort of precariously situated on the edge. Maybe they're messing around with their cell phone, right? The footbridge is really low. So all you have to do is, push them over real easy. You can do it, right? If you push them in front of the train, that 500-pound person is going to stop the trolley and it's going to save the 5 people. Okay? So the question is, do you push the large person over the footbridge to stop the trolley? A lot of people say no. People say no. And so you ask them why. And they say stuff like, look, I don't want to actively harm someone. It feels gross. Maybe they'll start to mention stuff about the tragedy of the scenario and just like not wanting to get involved. They don't want to directly murder someone. It feels like they're murdering the large person. They start to offer more deontological reasons. I don't want to harm anyone, right? The large person is a person and I feel like I don't have the right to end their life. If you look at the scenario, consequence-wise, it's the same exact thing. You're still just sacrificing one person to save the 5. And so what they did was they looked at the fMRIs, and what they found was, look, there are basically 2 different ways of making different types of decisions. So this led to their dual process model. Okay? So this is kind of a complicated diagram again, but let me explain it. Right? Let me explain it. The top one is the idea of the trolley problem, the first one, right? With just the tracks and pulling the lever. Okay? What they found was in that scenario, it is emotionally cool. Because you aren't thinking about interacting with any of these people, you're interacting with a lever, a piece of machinery, right? You might be a little distressed, but it's relatively emotionally cool. And whenever you're emotionally cool, you can just think about the pure numbers of the situation, the consequences, the utilitarian stuff, right? Saving 5 is better than just saving 1. And so you get the judgment. This is what the thumbs up is, to pull the lever. Yes, I pull the lever. Why? Because it saves 5 at the expense of 1 rather than just letting the 5 die and the 1 live. The sort of indifferent smiley is to indicate emotionally cool, this situation, all right? Whereas in the footbridge scenario, so now we're down at the bottom part, it's emotionally hot because you're thinking about literally touching another person and throwing them in front of the train, and just like that emotional contact really makes it distressing, right? So you still know that it's a 5 sort of 1 thing, but what you have here is these negative emotions overriding the sort of reason. This is what, Josh Greene and Liane Young are going to kind of argue, okay? So they try to say 2 things with respect to this, especially Josh Greene. Josh Greene has stated these points much strongly, much more adamantly, more repetition. The first one is basically he's going to say, look, the obvious answer here is that you should pull the lever and you should push the large person. All things considered, they're the exact same scenario. And you should save more people if you're ever given the opportunity. So whenever you look at cases where they make the right decision, the lever case, you find that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, okay, so it's a part at the front of the brain toward the side, It evolved in humans very, very well. These parts of the brains help us to abstract and think in the future and think about moral principles and stuff like that. They develop later in our lives in humans. They're the most developed as opposed to other species, right? Whenever people are making the right decision, the top scenario, the lever scenario, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is it's the part of the brain that's using the most energy being activated, right? That is what we should aim at in morality. And what is it like whenever we're using the VMPFC? We're utilitarians. Utilitarian thinking seems to be, associated with that part, that advanced, evolutionarily, complex part of the brain. So it shows that utilitarianism is pretty great. And moreover, whenever you look at the scenario where people make the wrong decision, so not to push the large person, it's more stuff in the midbrain, in the center, that's really deep, very primal, very old. We share it with other animals. It's emotional. It's emotional. I don't know what Kant would have thought of this, by the way. Kant thought that he was being rational, but Greene is saying, no, this is probably emotional, right? This is probably emotional. And because it's in a primal part of the brain, it's not a part that really helps us, to do the complex things that emotions that humans do. It's not in the most advanced, most recent part of the brain for humans, right? Because of that, that should show that deontology is worse off. So there's a sort of evolutionary debunking argument here. Because utilitarian insights, according to Greene, happen in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that says that utilitarianism is using the best, parts of our brains. And because deontology is using those primal parts, it shows that it's not using the most advanced stuff. We should trust utilitarian reasoning. Second thing is emotions can override the utilitarian or the rational judgments, right? So there's another aspect of the rationalism here. We shouldn't be using the sort of sentiments to make these decisions. We should be using the really advanced parts of our brain. So that's what Jonathan Greene and Liane Young are trying to show in their work. This is kind of all over the place. And it's a question as to what we make of this. So we started out with the rationalism, sentimentalism hybrid views. We saw the Jonathan Haidt case, which is sort of a descriptive case for sentimentalism. Sort of feels very Humean. We have Josh Greene. Peter Singer, by the way, was on his dissertation committee, who is doing similar descriptive work, but rather than coming to a sentimentalist conclusion, he comes to a rationalist conclusion. So we have empirical work, supporting either side. So what do we do with this? We have the Jonathan Haidt sentimentalism. We have the Joshua Greene rationalism. What do we do, right? Well, before I just, conclude the lecture, I just need to say, this relates to a really, really big problem in ethics that, all of these, maybe you can make a careful distinction between all of these, but I wanted to introduce all of these terms. It's called the is-ought gap, or the fact versus values distinction, or it's the difference between descriptive and normative claims. Descriptive claims are just saying how the world is, describing the world. It's like biology, you're just trying to say what a cell is and how it functions, versus normative claims, which are about how the world should be, right? And it involves values. It involves judgments about good and bad, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, just and unjust, those types of things. The question is, can you use facts or descriptions to arrive at values? Some people are going to say no. Some people are going to say yes. Okay, this is a really, really complex debate, so I don't really need to get too much into it. But certain people, for example, who are a type of naturalist, they're going to say, look, moral values just come down to facts out there in the world. The fact of pain or suffering. What we do with morality is just literally trying to avoid the most suffering or promote the most well-being. We can measure those things, right? It's not as precise, say, as, taking measurements on a house or a door or something like that, but we can measure these things. You can tell when an animal is in distress. You can tell when an animal is feeling relaxed and fulfilled and doing well. All morality is trying to do is to maximize that sort of thing. So facts and values are actually like really, really closely related, and you should be paying attention to the science. Other people are going to say the science is completely irrelevant. Neuroscience is completely irrelevant to morality, right? Because no matter how we think, you can always ask the question, yeah, but is that how we should think? So if you look at the Jonathan Haidt scenario and you see, yeah, most people are sentimental and they're making decisions based on emotions, but you could say, but that shows why most people shouldn't be trusted with important decisions. That shows why it's really, really important for judges or even, law enforcement officers. Maybe they should have more than 6 months of training. They should have years of training like they do in Europe, right? Because whenever we're making gut instinctive reactions, maybe that's not reliable, right? Maybe that's not reliable. So just because something is the case doesn't mean that it should be the case. And that's what this is-ought gap. It's a version of what sometimes gets called the naturalistic fallacy, although there's different versions of that, right? That's the question. So whenever we're trying to figure out, should we be rationalists and obey reason? Should we be sentimentalists and obey some sort of emotion? Should we be a hybrid and try and keep all of our faculties working right and balance them against each other some way, right? Some way. What do we do? And can we use this empirical psychological stuff to help settle that old philosophical debate? That's basically the question that we're dealing here, right? And I have the question here, what would be the natural advice? And I'm reminded of an Aristotle passage where he says, look, humans do have a capacity to do good things. It is natural in some ways, okay? It's not contrary to nature in the way that trying to teach a rock to fall upward would be unnatural, right? A rock is just going to fall toward the earth. But it's not natural in the sense that fish swim, once they have fish bodies and they're not eggs anymore, they can just naturally swim. Morality isn't like that, because it seems as though humans need to be educated in the right way to be doing the right things. So it's natural in the sense that we have a capacity, right? Rocks don't have a capacity to fall upward. We have a capacity to be good, but it's not so natural that it just happens without us needing to cultivate it very, very carefully. And so maybe my conclusion is something like a very tentative, very midline example, which is like, look, we need to pay attention to this empirical stuff. It's going to show us how most of us think. And it's going to show us how we can fail potentially at moral judgments, whether that's not taking reasons into account in the right way, or whether that's not taking emotions into account the right way, whether it's trying to think that the people who come to the wrong conclusions are selfishly motivated, or maybe they have some sort of emotion. The empirical stuff is going to help us to more accurately diagnose the problems, even if philosophers have to, also be good philosophers and offer arguments for why we should think in a certain way, why we should be rationalists or we should be sentimentalists. The general reason why I have you read the empirical stuff in addition to the philosophical stuff is because I think that the most insightful ethics and moral philosophy, and even literature, right? Literature, movies, the best works are the ones that understand actually how we behave, and then they sort of start from there. We need to be competent in the realities of the world before we start making certain types of judgments. So that's basically the insight that I'm going to leave you with. Rationalism, using your reason. Sentimentalism, using your emotion, or a hybrid theory. Jonathan Haidt seems to be leading a lot of credence to sentimentalism. Jonathan Haidt is doing that. Josh Greene tends to be leading credence to rationalism. This was the Peter Singer case that we read as well. Either way, though, I think what they're helping us to do is to figure out how we actually do think so that we can spend time trying to make sure that our moral theories are more plausible in light of empirical challenges. And if we want to affect the behavior of other people, and if we want people to be good, then the empirical stuff helps us to identify the challenges that often run counter to that so that we can educate people more effectively. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope that you're doing well. I'll see you next time.